Alrighty then, sorry to cut your discussion short. I apologize. I hope I haven't reduced the meaning of your discussions by cutting them short. They're not listening. That was just for you. It's a good one though, huh?
Yeah.
We'll see. Alright. So we left off. I've got a lot to cover. I don't want to get too encumbered by the slides. I have a lot of them, mostly because there's some cool pictures related to this stuff. The fascination with death for existentialists, I think, is significant. It's not new. I think it's weird to us today because we hide death. And I might have mentioned last time, actually maybe I didn't, we ran out of time. I was going to talk about Faulkner's. Anyone read Faulkner's As I Lay Dying? Turn of the century piece in which somebody, a member of the family, dies, and it was common to have them lie in bed for more than a day, and all the family members are there, right? And they're all, it's a kind of, it's just how it was. There was not many other options, first of all. But it was a different way of approaching life by being confronted, especially if you lived on a farm, being confronted by death all the time. Most people don't live on farms today. Farms are taken over by giant agribusinesses that we don't see. We go to the grocery store. My kids don't understand death, really. We've talked about it before. But it's not like they live on the farm and their favorite pig has died. Do you remember Wilbur? Yeah. So that was some pig. But kids, is that wrong? Is that wrong? Kids then, when they grow up, they're confronted with it. They have to discuss it. They have to address it. They have to face it. Now we buy food. We call it meat. We don't call it what it is. Meat's a euphemism for carcass, for a thing that's dead.
Human meat.
Well, that's Soylent Green that you're thinking of. Anyone from that? All right.
It's people, yeah.
It's people. Anyway, I like this one. Saint Jerome. What is he doing? He's just sort of nonchalantly pointing at the skull, which is a common thing to have on people's desks. Why? What is he saying? Is he saying, "Hey, it's Halloween"? No. He's saying, "Yeah, you're alive. I'm alive too, but this is where we're going. This guy is not alive." Right. But he's not just saying that. It's not like in an individual, this dude's dead. It's we're all moving toward this. To borrow from Martin Heidegger, also interested in questions of our finitude. What's finitude?
That we're going to end.
That we're going to end. All beings are beings toward death. The moment we're born, we're beings toward death, which doesn't sound terribly uplifting. But it is interesting how existentialists respond to this. And existentialists respond in different ways. You see this again. This is still life on a vanity. All of the vanities. There's a lot of interesting things in the background. And of course, there's the dice, there's money, there's the bones. And then there's the concept of time. This is a fantastic painting. There's other examples of this, and if you go to this link, you'll be able to find this painting is fascinating, that if you walk around it, that's a skull. You can't really tell, but when you walk around the painting and turn the painting, it sort of shows up. It's really quite eerie.
It's like those things where it's like really long letters. You do it like this to read the message.
Kind of, yes. It's a kind of visual illusion, which is fascinating. In any case, it gets at some of the issues. This is the kind of thing that Camus is addressing in his The Stranger, but especially in Sisyphus, and an absurd reasoning, which we're going to get to all of that today. In fact, let me start with The Stranger. This is the one I have. I like doing contemporary philosophy because I can show a lot of images, because there's always a lot of editions, a lot of interesting covers. Why they choose the covers that they do, I think, is fascinating. Here's how it starts. You didn't have this section. You didn't have this part of the reading. But this gives you the kind of person that Mersal is. He's the main character of The Stranger. He's the guy that's in the prison cell confronting the priest toward the end. Why is he there? Well, you can see with this image here, he shot a man on the beach with very little fanfare, very little emotional reaction. It was very matter of fact. Basically seeing the sun glint in his eye. There was some confusion or whatever, but he shot him a couple of times, so he's guilty of murder. I don't want to get too much into the background of that, but you kind of get a sense of who he is with the opening lines of the text, which start this way. Mother died today, or maybe yesterday. I can't be sure. The telegram from the home says, your mother passed away. Funeral tomorrow. Deep sympathy. Which leaves the matter doubtful. It could have been yesterday. So this is an odd way to respond, and he's this way throughout. It's only when he's thinking of his mother in physicality, in terms of place where she has been, where there's things, and he can imagine her walking around the area, or tangible stuff of hers, that he's able to feel much of anything. And Camus is pushing this line, distinguishing himself from a Sartrean view about the self. For Camus, so much of this is about physicality, about the physical lived experiences. And I quoted from this the Serge Zabrowski last time, where he distinguishes Sartre and Camus and their conceptions of death. For Sartre, it's the concern of loss of thought, and that's so difficult to grasp. For Camus, it's the conception of the loss of a heartbeat, that anything else, any other experiences are going to be gone. I'll have no other possibility of physical experiences in this world. The idea of my heart stopping in my chest just seems inconceivable to Camus. So, why does he write in this style? Why do any of these existentialists write in this way? We sort of touched on this with Dostoevsky before. He's dealing with philosophical issues, Dostoevsky was, but he's doing so in a literary fashion. Dostoevsky has seemingly a lot of background in philosophical writing. And in fact, I didn't bring that with me either, but one of the foils, if you want, that he's responding to, Dostoevsky, is Socrates. If you recall, Dostoevsky has the spiteful man do that which is disadvantageous to himself, harms himself, and does so knowingly. How is that a reversal of a Socratic view? Some of you may take ancient philosophy. You may remember Socrates. One of his famous sayings is that no one knowingly does evil. No one knowingly does wrong. The spiteful man seems to turn that on its head and show, no, I'm conscious of what I'm doing. I know it's harmful, and I know it's wrong, and I'm going to do it anyway. And in a way, I don't know that he mentions Socrates, although Camus mentions Dostoevsky, who in the relationship to Socrates, I think is interesting. But he's sort of shifting that around, not in an argumentative fashion, not in, here's the argument I'm going to make, but here's what I'm going to show you. A novel's never anything but philosophy put into images, says Camus, which is quite nice. What's wrong with arguments? Well, they don't really give us reasons to live. They don't really make sense of the world. And we're going to be talking about, well, this is from the existentialist standpoint. No one ever died for the ontological argument, he says. Actually, that's from the myth of Sisyphus. I think he's probably right about that. Is it going too far to say that we rarely change our minds one way or the other based on argument?
No.
Is that right?
No.
It's not right.
It's not right all the time, but I think it's easier to change things by provoking people's feelings than by presenting logical arguments.
Yeah, why is that?
Because people get convinced more with their feelings than with by thinking about it. A lot of people like to be convinced without even knowing that they're being convinced. And also,
wait, they like that? How would they? What do you mean?
I think the first way of communicating things was through stories, and people like to be entertained.
Yeah, yeah. There's something to the notion of we love narratives, we love stories, and rational deductive logic, for example, that's relatively new. We didn't use that, nor would we have needed it, let's say, thousands of years ago. Reason probably didn't evolve for the sake of tracking the truth in a philosophical way, which doesn't mean we can't use it for that now. So that's interesting. Yeah, it may be that we're storytelling creatures, and that alone makes for existentialism and continental philosophy in general a more accessible form of presenting ideas.
What is ontological?
Sorry, ontological argument. Saint Anselm wrote an argument, actually in the form of a prayer to God, for God's existence. It's called, after Immanuel Kant named it, the ontological argument for the existence of God, just based on the concept of God and the meanings of the terms involved. A deductive proof that leads to the necessary conclusion that God exists. Nobody read that, Camus is saying, and said, now I believe. In fact, think about that. I don't want to dwell on it too much, but do you ever recall changing your mind on some matter of relative importance based upon somebody saying, here are the reasons? Think about it. Or does mind changing happen over kind of a long period of time where you're not really even aware of it? When did you become religious? Or when did you become non-religious? Or when did you come to advance this political view or that political view or this idea? Typically it's, I don't know, sometime around then, and it was a process. Rather than, this argument changed my mind. Yeah.
Is the ontological, I can't remember, is it separate from the cosmological?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Chase, and then back. Okay, Paul.
I think for me, like, when my problems were because, like, I was overwhelmed with too many feelings, it helped me to, like, be told in a logical way, like, let's say, for example, I feel, like, really hopeless or depressed, and I'm like, what's the point of anything? And, like, because there's no point in anything, like, why am I doing anything? And then, like, logically, well, I have to, like, change a little bit of, like, the thing and say, well, if nothing matters, then just do whatever you want. And then I'm like, oh, yeah, and then...
Nothing matters. Well, this is timely as far as the reading for today. So Camus has a response to that. And there are lots of responses to that. And some of them are intellectual, some of them are purely logical. Camus is not fond of that. Others are existential, and others are just purely emotional. Some are religious, and we'll go through some of those. And let me preface this. In fact, just to jump a little bit ahead, I brought too much damn stuff. I'm sorry. The reading you had from the myth of Sisyphus, he says in the preface on page 7, for me, the myth of Sisyphus marks the beginning of an idea which I was to pursue in The Rebel. So in The Rebel, that's more of a political view dealing with issues of whether or not one should kill others, whereas the myth of Sisyphus is addressing whether or not one should kill themselves. It attempts to resolve the problem of suicide as the rebel attempts to resolve that of murder, in both cases without the aid of eternal values, which, temporarily perhaps, are absent or distorted in contemporary Europe. And again, he's writing in around 1942. At this point, they were unsure of the end of World War II, whether or who was going to win. Imagine not knowing if the Nazis were going to win. That was unknown at this time. In fact, things were not looking good. He says, the fundamental subject of the myth of Sisyphus is this. It is legitimate and necessary to wonder whether life has a meaning. And he doesn't capitalize meaning there. Maybe he should. Therefore, it is legitimate to meet the problem of suicide face to face. The answer underlying and appearing through the paradoxes which cover it is this. Even if one does not believe in God, suicide is not legitimate. This is page 7. So he tells us up front. It takes quite a bit of time to get to the conclusion why he thinks that, which this is what we'll get to. Yes?
To go back to your question, do you think you can argue with someone and change their minds? I think it depends on what you're arguing about. I think if you're arguing about something as complex as the idea of God, then probably not, because that idea comes through not only talking about ideas but experience. And if you need to base your idea off of experience and not just talk about ideas, and talking about ideas, not going to change your mind.
Yeah, maybe.
But with that being said, if someone, talking about suicide, let's say someone's about to kill themselves right now, you can change their mind about not wanting to kill themselves in that moment if you talk about it. From personal experience, it is 100% accurate. Not from me from me having talked.
Yeah.
It has worked and their life has changed, so I think it depends on what kind of idea you're talking about.
Yeah.
Some ideas can be changed with just words, some can't.
Right, that's interesting. I'll come back to that, your example actually, in a short bit. Thank you. Yeah.
Did Camus think that absurdity was a human universal or a modern universal? Like, let's say you rewound time 500 years, would Camus think that the life of those humans was just as absurd?
How long ago?
500 years.
He wouldn't say that their lives are absurd necessarily. He would say they would come to recognize it if they are thinking beings and they're honest with themselves. Yeah, 500 years ago, this is, sure. He's around Descartes. He'd be like, Descartes should have realized this. But Descartes would be engaged in what later Sartre will call bad faith, in assuming an out, in assuming hope for another life. And so Camus would say, perhaps it takes the events of the 20th century to lead people to recognize it and shove it in their faces, the absurdity of reality, in a way that maybe we didn't have before. But there have always been genocides. There have always been plagues. In fact, Camus has another play called The Plague that addresses some of these themes as well. So I think this condition of, this human condition, not so much nature, but condition of recognizing our absurdity, is something that requires consciousness. So it depends how far back we want to go with this. But it's not clear to me that he wouldn't say 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago, humans could have and should have recognized the absurdity of it all. In fact, Tertullian in the 1st century AD says something like, I believe in God because it is absurd. That's a direct quote. And Camus likes half of that. I'll say why in a little bit. Let me get one more hand and then move on. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to respond to the idea of some ideas being unprovable and changing your mind like that.
And different methods of being able to change your mind. Your own mind or others is what's the issue, yeah.
Yeah, I think, well, as far as that, I've seen my own mind change very quickly, but also watched it gradually change. That's different. But I also think it doesn't have to do with the idea. That's like saying an argument can't be proven just because one person has argued it this way and it failed, And maybe it wasn't a good enough argument to represent that.
I see. Yeah.
It's like saying you can 100% talk someone out of killing themselves. That's not a guarantee.
No, it isn't. And I want to return to that. And the different experiences of different situations going to vary. And one response, it depends on who you're talking to. It depends on the context. You can imagine a kind of absurdity in not necessarily the existentialist sense of trying to appeal to argument when dealing with an existential matter. I'm reminded of Kierkegaard's claim, trying to prove the existence of God to someone is like trying to explain to a person dying of thirst what the chemical compositions of water is. I'm not quite sure if I got that right, but you get the sense of what Kierkegaard is saying. But that's going to vary based upon context, I think, and I want to return to that as we go. So let me wrap this introductory part up, I think according to words and not according to ideas. In other words, Camus says, I'm not a philosopher, yet he did his dissertation on Plotinus and Augustine, so those are philosophers. And I'm definitely not an existentialist, but he is. He's always included, whether he wanted to be or not, he basically is. And then he says, then he offers us some truth about meaning and existence. If these aren't philosophical, existential issues, then I don't know what is. These are some questions I want us to think about as we go. not only with the stranger, but also with what we're going to cover with Sisyphus, which in fact we've already started on. Consider these as we go. Is there a difference between a man or person condemned to death and everyone else? Back to Heidegger. Man is a being towards death. So technically, we are all already condemned. The difference is, for most of us, we don't know when and how that's going to be. Whereas the condemned person surely does. At the time dealing with capital punishment. And interestingly, Camus speaks about capital punishment quite a bit in his political writings, in his meditations on the guillotine. He is not a fan of the death penalty. He always thought it was disproportionate. And for this reason, because you're telling the person, this is how you're going to die, and this is the moment that you're going to die. And he goes on beyond that, showing that that kind of knowledge is potentially debilitating and is always inconsistent or disproportional to the crime. There's a lot more to say about that, but I don't want to get into that now. This next question I think is essential. Does the length of one's life determine its meaning? How long one lives? Yeah, you might be surprised what Camus' answer to this is. Is an afterlife or a belief in one necessary for meaning? Is there anything more to justice than human laws? This comes up both in The Stranger and Sisyphus. And what are your reactions to The Stranger? Do you think this is meant as a story to evaluate the character, or is it meant really to evaluate your responses to the character? Is it meant for a self-evaluation? Is it a critique of society? Is it a critique of a certain kind of person who doesn't seem to have much concern about much at all? Is it a critique of alienation? Or is it an explanation of it? And I'm going to jump through this fairly quickly. This concept of alienation is one that's in the background of The Stranger in particular, and it's one that informs also in the background of Sisyphus, of if you want, undergirding this of this conception of the absurd. It's mostly coming from a guy named Karl Marx, some of you have heard of. There's a lot of different themes related to alienation that are complex within Marx. I'm just going to gloss over them. I just want you to know where this concept is originating, and it's very much influential on Camus and Sartre. The concept of alienation from Marx, he once said this. I don't know if he actually said this. It's attributed to him. There were people who were followers of his Marxist ideology that were in France doing things that he didn't agree with, and in response to what they were doing, he said this: all I know is that I'm not that. I think he meant that kind of Marxist, I think is what he was talking about. But that cat looks like, he really does. I mean, do you see? I mean, there's no question. That's Karl Marx. You see? See why that's good? There he is, 1883. This quote I've referenced before. Philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. Who does this sound like? Recall the reading from last time and the concern of the man of action, who is what for Dostoevsky? Stupid. But the intelligent man, the thoughtful person, the conscious person, they're aware. In fact, they're hyper-aware, and they're in a bit of a bind because of that consciousness. That's that consciousness that reveals to them, as Camus will also agree, the absurd. And so we're stuck in a bind ourselves. Dostoevsky's concerned about inaction because of too much theorizing, too much thinking. It seems Marx is concerned about that as well. I think he's exaggerating things here when he says philosophers have only interpreted it. I think that's just false. Philosophers have also tried to change it. And in order to change it in the way that you want it changed, that requires theorizing, that requires figuring out what is wrong with it, which is in fact what Marx is doing, what we'll see Camus doing, what you see Jean-Paul Sartre doing in their efforts at fighting tyranny, at their efforts at fighting oppression. They are attempting to change the world. So, and there are philosophers before Marx who were also in this way. Why am I mentioning him? Philosophy stands in the same relation to the study of the actual world as masturbation to sexual love. That's from Marx. Marx actually says that. Is a condemnation that the spiteful man gave us, the one who thinks too much, right, but doesn't actually do anything. It's like mental masturbation. And I apologize for the reference here, but really that's Diogenes. He really did do that. He lived in a barrel, and he really did. At one point he said, if only I could rub my belly and sate my hunger in the same way, I would do so. Diogenes was a fantastic philosopher. Very much Socratic. He just took Socrates to its logical extreme, right? If Socrates went just... Anyway, that's not quite related. Not quite. He was truly authentic, and I think there's something relevant about this when we talk about Sartre next week. So I think we'll return to Diogenes, who was not master, or was master of his domain. I'm not sure how to phrase that nowadays. Another concept of alienation for Marx that is in the background of Camus is this alienation from this feeling of separateness, this feeling of this... Heidegger will call it uncanny or unhome. I'm feeling unheimlich. I don't feel at home in the world. I feel a stranger. I feel estranged to it. I don't fit in it. And it could be that there is an interesting environmentalist argument that says the reason we feel that way is because we try to dominate it. If you look at other cultures in which this is not the case, there's a way in which they feel ensconced within it and interdependent with it, as opposed to alienated from it. And our attempt to overpower it, our attempt in the Marxist sense to accumulate and become owners, to become wealthy. I'm told that I don't recall how I know this, but this belt buckle is extraordinarily expensive. Somebody pointed that out to me once, like thousands of dollars. Does anyone recognize that belt buckle? Is there something relevant about that belt buckle that I should know about? Aside from just keeping up pants. Anyway, we're alienated from other people. Marx has a political but primarily economic critique about this. We might include other critiques with technology. How does technology alienate us from other people? Let me ask that question first, then I'll get your hand. How does technology alienate us when it seems like it should do the opposite? It should bring us together. But how does it actually alienate us? How does it actually separate us? Yeah?
Well, it depends on what you mean by bring us together. Because if you mean, there's a difference between, I forget the word for it, just this face-to-face interaction.
Virtual friendship versus human intersubjectivity, to borrow from Husserl and Sartre and others. On Facebook, I've got all sorts of friends. And I also can choose who I hang out with, in a way. But those are also not actual... In fact, Camus will respond to this concern of alienation, this concern of why stay, to use the verbiage of a text recently on suicide. And in part of it, he seems to imply at one point it's other people. But genuine relationships with other people. Let me get the other hands before I continue. Did you want to add more? I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, I just wanted to talk about, like, kind of like, I guess, like, a hierarchy of interaction, because I've found that, like, in, like, looking at myself, I know that there's a lot of people who I both interact with in person and not, like, through technology.
Yeah.
And then eventually, maybe like once a year I'll see them in person, and those relationships are still maintained and valuable to me.
And they may not be were it not for the technological threads connecting. So there could be a positive to technology.
But there is a prior relationship of in person. So
Sure.
I guess
That's interesting.
defeats it a bit.
Not necessarily fruits it, but it makes it complex. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
And then
so,
and then Paul. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. And then also we'll get all three. Go ahead. Yep.
okay. So, is it true that Marx viewed alienation like, almost like a difference, like a change of state, where you could be healthy or you could be alienated, while Camus would view alienation as the truth, right? So when Marx says that I'm alienated from other people, that means that there's a more healthy way to relate to other people, right? That maybe isn't possible in our society or whatever. So would Camus say that alienation is the actual reality? Is that
Yes, and recognizing it. We can fix part of that feeling of alienation with respect to other people, Camus would say. And
Marx
certainly would
doesn't
Marx,
agree with
they would agree. There's the alienation from,
Is that what he called absurdity?
well, that's what I'm going to get to. That's what I'm leading to. That's very good. This is what he says. I'm jumping a little ahead here. This is from his notebooks. This is 1940. Shoot. This is something he writes in his diary, which I don't think was meant for publication. But they published it anyway. It reminds me of Mother Teresa. She had her private letters to her priest, and it said explicitly, do not publish these. Burn these. Absolutely burn all of these letters. Because there's a lot of doubt that she did not want public. And her priest, you know how we know she said that? Because he published that in the publication of all the letters. He included that claim. Don't publish these. Burn everything. No. We feel it's better that it got out. I'm kind of glad it got out because I wouldn't have known that about it. It's fascinating. Mother Teresa is a very fascinating person. And she probably should have wanted those personal doubts revealed. In any case, what does he say? This is around 1942. He says, the thing that lights up the world and makes it bearable is the customary feeling we have of our connections with it, and more particularly, of what links us to human beings. Relations with other people always help us to carry on because they always suppose developments a future, and always because we live as if our only purpose were to have relations with human beings. I think that's quite powerful, and it fits with contemporary psychology that studies these flow experiences, that's studying happiness, which is in a way the other edge, other side of the coin of Sisyphus, which is not studying necessarily happiness, although that issue comes up. That what we find in longitudinal studies for a happy life is not financial success, it's not fame, it's not power, it is long-lasting, genuine friendships. Right? That plays a significant role. I'll return to that in a moment, but let me get a couple more hands. Yes, Paul, and then I think you had... No? Okay, go ahead.
Does the term alienation imply that there's like a greater and a lesser, or is there like alienation where it's both ways, or is there alienation where like one person doesn't want to be alienated and the other person wants?
It depends. So I'll talk about that with Sartre, with the different hierarchy and his concept of the look, where I define myself by, and I recognize myself as a subject based upon the perception of others, and where one is in a particular social hierarchy can amend that, can change that. But for Camus, he doesn't necessarily speak of it in terms of hierarchy. I'm alienated from myself, I'm alienated from others. I was going to get into this with Kierkegaard. I'm going to return to that later. But I'm alienated from myself when I'm acting inauthentically, and I just join what Heidegger would call das Mann, or just the herd, or everyone. Kierkegaard uses the term the herd, where I don't think for myself, authentically, individually. And there, I guess, the hierarchy would be, if you want to use that language, the group versus the individual. The individual's getting sucked up, and I alienate it from myself. But for our purposes, back to your question earlier, Jordan, about where the absurd is, this is what it's leading to. And that concept of alienation is underlying it. Lex?
I was gonna ask, could you, like, or if you want to hypothetically, like, try to insinuate the idea that they are alienated in the way that, like, they dress themselves a certain way, like, even in the picture,
the two people?
Yeah, so, like, he still has Nike shoes on, even though it's obvious he's dilapidated in this picture. His life is not nearly as good as a guy wearing the Sario Ferragamo, whatever his name is, belt.
That's what that is?
Yeah.
Okay.
Something. It's the reverse Chanel sign, so it annoys me. But regardless, it's like a $400 belt, and
That's
if
nothing.
you dress yourself in such a way that you have a belt that looks nice, and you wear whatever items, even though you can't necessarily afford them, or like
I see what you mean.
yourself.
We don't know anything about this guy.
Exactly.
Yeah,
just to come across as alienating others.
Right. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, we don't know. Oftentimes, this is culture can push this, where we want to present ourselves in a particular way, And in doing so, did you say we may be alienating others in the choices that we make?
Yeah, because you want to appear better
Yeah.
off than you actually are in such a way.
This
So
is-
you would be, because obviously this picture is mainly just to focus on the clothing
Yeah.
and the clearly.
But it's not irrelevant. It
But like-
reminds me of high school when I had to wear a uniform and I didn't understand why, and I wouldn't do it sometimes because it was Houston, it was terribly hot, and it was thick corduroy. It was total nonsense. And I would get penance halls. Do you know what a penance hall is? PH. That's what they called them. And you'd sit there at your desk, hands on the table for like 30 minutes and doing nothing. Or you would copy out words from the dictionary, like comportment and other words. Boy, did I learn a lot. And I would get continually punished. So why? Why do I have to wear a uniform? Because those are the rules, was the response. Which is a non-answer. That's like what terrible parents do when their kids ask because I said so. If they had told me, which I found out later was the case, we have uniforms so that high school kids who are quite awful sometimes will make fun of other kids because they can't afford certain clothes. If you have everyone wearing the same thing, you avoid that kind of nastiness where some are made fun of because they don't have the right clothes. That's actually one of the reasons for uniforms, at least at this particular school. If they had told me that, I would have said, I think, maybe I wouldn't have. Maybe I'm rationalizing, but that's a damn good reason. I understand that. I will now wear my uniform proudly.
So he,
And my reverse Chanel belt.
yeah, you're Salvatore Ferragamo, there you go. But regardless, we don't know how the other man acquired these Nike shoes.
That's true.
We don't know if he bought them or if he stumbled upon them.
Well,
You know,
we may
like-
not need to know that to know, well, he's not in a great situation
Yeah, but
at that
you know,
particular
like,
situation.
it's- I don't know. that's what struck me so interesting.
And I think that's right.
The labels of the clothing, but
We can't know everyone's experience. I think that's a legitimate point that leads to where they are now. But Camus would say, Sartre would say, you as an individual do, you know it, and you need to take responsibility for it.
I just wanted to respond and say that, like, in that, like, we're also alienating all those people by making assumptions.
exactly. Just by assuming.
Yeah,
and if you were pretending, would you also be alienating yourself?
So let me. I want to return to that with Sartre's conception of the look again, because I think that's connected to this as well. What is underlying Camus' question in the myth of Sisyphus? What is the basis? What does he start with as a presumption, without argument, and then lead us to his conclusions regarding the ultimate question of philosophy? A world that can be explained even with bad reasons is a familiar one. Actually, that's relevant. If they gave me bad reasons for why I had to wear a uniform, that would have been a reason at least, and I wouldn't have been as pissed. But they didn't give me any reasons. They just said, because I said so. We like stories, we like narratives, we also like explanations, right? And as Camus says, a world that can be explained with even bad ones, bad reasons, at least it's familiar. Or in German, heimlich. It is homely. It's not. We don't have that uncanny feeling of it being funny or strange or weird or out of place. And you may not experience this. Maybe we don't have opportunities to experience it because we always have something that we can be looking at. We rarely have moments where we can just look, as Sartre does, contemplating the roots of a particular maple tree and then coming to the conclusion that his existence is merely contingent and not necessary. It's a weird thought. And I'll have to tell you, I was too young to know what the hell was going on, but it was an experience of the uncanny, of the absurd, when I was maybe 6, 7, 8, I don't know how old I was. I was looking at a jar in a medicine cabinet, and I was just sitting there, and I remember it vividly. It said Vaseline, and I wondered, where the hell did that word come from? And that made me wonder, where do these things come from? Have they always been? And I can't at all put this into words. First of all, because I was 6, I didn't really know what the hell I was thinking. But my remembrance of it was similar to this recognition that things are somewhat fleeting. This hasn't always been. This came about at some point, and it's going to go away at some point. And I can't really explain the experience, but it's similar to this conception now of what Camus will call the absurd, or what Sartre will call with his description in the book Nausea, the recognition of my contingency, which is, as a 6-year-old, I didn't know. I'm still not entirely sure what Sartre means by that, other than to say that our existence is dependent upon other things. We are not necessary being. Other things caused us to be. Our existence is fleeting. That's a key motif throughout. So what is it? What is this absurd, or the absurd? It is a recognition, and it requires a conscious recognition of the fact that we desire questions, that we desire to question, that we desire answers, that we seek a rational universe, and at the same time, we just know we will not get those questions answered, that they are unanswerable, and we will not stop questioning. We know that, and we are stuck in that tension, and we cannot get out of it. That is the recognition of the absurd. We can get out of it, but there are different approaches to it. We can use hope and faith. That's not the right way, and we'll see why. We can accept it in a way that Camus doesn't like and end our lives and allow the absurd to take us over. Or we can fight against it, continually rebel against it, knowing the contingency and ultimate meaninglessness, fruitlessness of our lives, and yet still, in the end, be happy. He uses this word. We'll see why he does this. Yes, real quick.
He says, it becomes clear, on the contrary, that a life will be lived all the better if it has no meaning. Living an experience, a particular fate, is accepting it fully.
Yeah, I don't like this use of fate. That throws things off and makes it really hard to explain. When he uses fate, I think Sartre might have done this at one point too, that thoroughly confuses me. And I don't have an explanation for why he throws that in there. Because with fate, at least, and he's well versed in Greek mythology. In fact, he references a lot regarding Greek mythology, Roman mythology. The fates are personifications. These are beings with intentionality, setting things up to be a particular way. I think what he means is we are our own fate, and meaning is not something that's given to us. So here Sartre and Camus will agree. I don't live my life with meaning already assumed. That takes it off of me. And it's ignoring one of the poles of the tension between the absurd, recognizing we have this question, this driving for meaning, and our reason at the same time telling us it's not going to happen. And it's not something that's purely abstract. I'm glad I had this slide here. It's not just me pondering it, thinking, does life have any meaning? Intellectually, like Descartes considers his doubt in the Meditations. That's what Peirce would call a paper doubt. That's not real, genuine doubt. That's not bodily. You're not experiencing it. Do you remember a discussion of doubt, what it's like? Is there a test today? What room is the test in? What does that feel like? That's very different than, I wonder if I can doubt my own existence as a body. Let me see if I can intellectually. Very different things for Camus. Yeah.
Can you explain the role of alienation in understanding the concept of the absurd, but also how it applies to the examples you gave us about alienation earlier?
Well, there's a number of examples. The key one he wants to focus on is alienation from life.
Oh.
So there's a lot of concepts, some of which Camus will adopt from Marx, but primarily he's focused on the existential conception of it, where...
How is it different from the Marx's alienation?
Marx is almost entirely concerned with material conditions, economic conditions, political conditions. In this text, Camus is interested in the existential. And a bit of the epistemic too, but he doesn't focus on that. He doesn't explicitly state that. So and when we get to the Sisyphus in more detail, I hope to be able to address that question.
Okay.
But it's a good question. Think of Marx more politically, Camus, in this case, existentialist.
Wait, does the Marx one, does that have to do with the quote about him not considering himself a Marxist?
Oh, no. That was just a bit of amusement.
Oh.
So that was in reference to some French followers who called themselves Marxist around the time that he was writing, who were engaged in certain kinds of political acts he thought were inauthentic and not what he was pushing.
Oh.
And that's
I
why.
thought that was like an example of alienation.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that way. Sorry. That was confusing. Yes, Aaron.
I was just curious, does Camus conclude that there are no answers, or that we just are unable to get those answers?
Oh, that's a damn good question. So, he is a skeptic, I think. He, with respect to questions of meaning, although at other times he seems to be saying, there is no meaning, but don't stop living, which is not necessarily contradictory. But I think he's not a relativist. He, in fact, explicitly argues against relativism, which is to say, well, everyone has their own truth, right? He mentions Aristotle's law of non-contradiction at one point. I think that was included in the reading you had for today that I kept for you to read. I think he's more of a skeptic. He thinks there might be an ultimate meaning, but human beings, we don't have access to it. There might be certain kinds of explanations. The world may be rational in the end, but we're incapable for whatever reason he doesn't use the phrase cognitively closed, but that's kind of where I see it. He seems more of a skeptic than, what was the other option you suggested?
Just that there is no answer.
That there is no answer. Yeah. I think it's hard to textually defend that, but I think he's closer to a skeptic with respect to that than to say that there is none. Because to say there is no meaning is to have already established a position, to be kind of atheistic toward it. I probably should have a trolley meme for every philosopher, just to clarify at the end what they're thinking. This is not very good. Anyway, I'm going to move on. Well, that's the nihilist trolley problem. We'll get back to nihilism with Nietzsche in more detail. So let's get to the myth of Sisyphus. There's Camus, smoking as always, and there's his backpack. I thought that was funny. College backpack. The boulder. It's not really. I'm joking about that. Question?
Yeah, I have a question. So Camus seems to have a lot of fondness for actors as like the representation of...
James Dean?
No, just like...
The representation of what?
Like actors, like in a play, as like a representation of the absurd.
Oh, yeah.
Would it be true that an actor isn't really a good representation because, he'll go out and play different roles, but then, takes off the mask or whatever of the play and he leaves it behind and he goes home to his family and, let's say he goes to church or whatever. Would the ultimate absurd actor be someone who all they do is play the roles and there is no person under the mask?
Isn't that all actors? Just kidding.
Sartre will have something to say about that, in this case with a waiter, which is actually a great example because oftentimes, at least in the United States, a lot of times waiters say, I'm not really a waiter, I'm an actress or I'm an actor, and I'm just doing this. That's what I said when I waited tables. I'm really a philosophy professor. I'm just waiting tables until I get a job teaching philosophy. So there's a kind of self-deception, if that were the case. And that would be, in a way, the ultimate. But actors, of course, there's no... why assume that if one's job is to be an actor, that they can do nothing but act? I can go home and turn off philosophy. Actually, sometimes it's hard. It pisses everyone off. But you can turn it off. You have a job. You go. Actually, this is relevant. Some of you may have jobs now that you despise. You feel like Sisyphus, and I don't mean to belittle that comparison. And then you absolutely don't want to take any of it home. So surely we can compartmentalize. I don't think Camus would have a problem with an actor who acts on stage, but then can shut that off and be themselves. Although, if they're really good at acting, maybe they're too good. I'm told that, who was it? Jim Carrey, when he did
That Andy movie.
Andy
And
Kaufman.
He lost his sense of self.
Yeah, he lost his sense of self, and he never got out of character. People freaked out. It's like, dude, this is Andy Kaufman. I think it's really him. So that's a different kind of psychosis that a breaking point. But I don't think that's necessarily normal for
I was
actors.
also about to mention something like that, like wouldn't, in that sense, all good actors be able to take on a form of method acting and actually learn from whatever they're studying, as many like actors do. They have to put themselves in
Yeah.
the position of whatever their piece. Daniel Day-Lewis is an excellent,
Yeah. he's a good one.
excellent example. The last Mohicans ran away into the forest for 2 months. They couldn't get him back.
Oh, I didn't know he did
Last
that.
boat, he broke his rib so that he would better
Oh,
get his
that's-
bottom two ribs removed, so he'd better lean in his
Oh,
chair.
that seems pretty
Like,
foolish.
that's a
That's
lot.
not why he had his ribs
But-
removed.
Yes!
No, sorry. So.
Get out of here, knock it off, stop it. Only the last
So I don't want to get too much into that. I want to return to this discussion with Sartre and his example of the waiter, because I think there it's more applicable. I don't know that it applies specifically to Camus here. So,
Where did
How
the
did
acting
you
thing
call
come
it
from?
that?
say again?
Because I thought I also read something about the acting thing too.
About what?
Like about how actors can take on this role or whatever role they study because all the rest of us have just been repeating events of history. Everyone else has already made these mistakes. Everyone else
Well,
already had these feelings.
yeah, and
following the footsteps.
there the connection might be because Camus is trying to get at human condition, and one of the
Yeah,
ways of
exactly.
getting at the human condition is not just to look at it from my perspective, but to again use the Husserlian phenomenological term, the intersubjectivity. As an actor, I need to know not just how I would be in a particular situation, but how others would behave. In fact, that's what actors have to do. They get into the head of another person. Not what would I do in this situation, but what would this particular person do in this situation? And that's what really good actors are able to do. Meryl Streep, for example, is fantastic at it. Although the president has a low opinion of her, so she must not be. All right, let's move on. I'm sorry. There he is. There's Heidegger. Cheery fellow. We're all beings toward death, he says. That's him smiling right there. That's how Nazis smiled. He really was a Nazi. I'm going to skip through a lot of this because I'm running out of time. To be born in imbecility in the midst of pain and crisis, to be a plaything of ignorance, error, need, sickness, wickedness, and so on. That is what is called life, the most important gift of our parents. Oh, in nature. That is life. That's going to relate to a little bit, I think, of what Camus has to say. You see, Shakespeare has conceptions of what Camus is writing about well before. Shakespeare wrote quite a bit that was deep, insightful, psychological, philosophical. We might as well talk about Hamlet as well, in his famous soliloquy, where he asks what? Yes, that's the question. That's. I mean, is this not plagiarism? Is not the Sisyphus? That's a Spoonerism. Is not the Sisyphus? Isn't this what Shakespeare already addressed? Right? Yes, and on it goes. That struts and frets, and then is heard no more, is a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Of course, it doesn't end with that, but this is kind of what we find in Sisyphus. It's hard to say. The story of Sisyphus, he ends with that. We have a long sort of entryway into it. I'm going to start with it and then kind of move back to it. Sisyphus, of course, really quickly, somebody explain the fate, the frustrations of Sisyphus.
Sisyphus was, I forget what he was when he was alive, but when he died, he committed such ghastly crimes that he was sanctioned in Hades to forever, eternally push a rock up a cliff.
Yeah.
And then once he got it to the top, it would
Roll right back
always
down.
roll back down to the bottom, and he was doomed to eternally push the rock.
Right. He had stolen things and he had done things to the god and he had chained death, I think, at one point. And he had actually been given life. He'd been allowed the opportunity to roam Earth and he loved it so. He didn't want to return. He wanted to stay, and here's Camus, and experience the feeling of sun on his face, to experience wind, to have experiences. And as the punishment, which humans are pretty good at doing, we're really good at punishing people. If you don't believe it, there was a whole museum, a traveling museum called The History of Torture. It was amazing, usually around the medieval period, of instruments humans come up with to torture people. And prisons do this really well. We have solitary confinement. This is a thing, this is a mode of torture. And if you're in long enough, it's a mode of breaking you mentally. And in many cases leads to suicide. And we've done well, so to speak, in developing systems that do this. Again, with prisons, in one form of punishment is to have prisoners go out and dig holes and then fill them back up. That kind of punishment, the kind of futility involved in it, psychologically is damaging. And yet what does Camus in the end say? That we can imagine, we should imagine Sisyphus with his face up against the rock as actually being happy. He opens the reading for today with, I think, a pretty good hook, as far as hooks go, right? As far as people writing opening lines for their papers, there's one truly so serious philosophical question, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. All the rest, whether or not the world has 3 dimensions, whether it has 9, 12 categories, that all comes afterwards. These are games one must first answer. And if it is true, as Nietzsche claims, that a philosopher, to deserve our respect, must preach by example, you can appreciate the importance of that reply, for it will precede the definitive act. These are facts the heart can feel. Again, Camus is very much about this conception of the bodily, the phenomenological. Yet they call for careful study before they become clear to the intellect. All the other philosophical questions, epistemological, political, metaphysical, they pale in comparison, and they are ultimately, they're not irrelevant, but they're certainly secondary. They're games. They ought not be even considered until we address the first and most fundamental question. And when you read that, and then his connection with suicide, I wonder if that struck you as odd. This idea that in this grand, gently indifferent, I like how he adds the word gentle. Why he adds the word gentle, I'm not sure, something to consider. Gently indifferent universe. Indifferent in the sense that it doesn't imbue meaning to us, for us, doesn't give it to us. Why is it that then the question of suicide even arises? It seems he, to borrow from Drew Weston, is anyone familiar with Drew Weston? He's, no, not Drew Weston. Dr. Drew, what's the guy's name? Is it Drew Weston? The guy, Dr. Drew Pinsky. Drew Pinsky. Anyone familiar with that person? He's kind of a popular dude. Anyway, he's a clinical psychologist. He deals with issues of suicide on a daily basis. He has hundreds of patients who come see him over the years. And he had made a reference at one point to Camus and the philosophical question of meaning, and then and question of suicide. And he thought it strange because clinically it isn't very often the case that one goes from a philosophical recognition that there's not ultimate meaning with a capital M in the universe to what's the point with respect to my particular existence. That doesn't seem to get at the actual clinical issues of real people. So it's unclear, and I don't want to dismiss Camus that quickly and say, well, he's not even dealing with the real issue here. I don't want to dismiss it that quickly. I want to get at what his arguments are. And there's a joke for you. While condemned by the gods to Hades to roll his rock up a hill, do you think Sisyphus was allowed to listen to any rock music? And Camus says, yes, of course, rock and roll. It's hilarious. You are welcome. He does make a connection, Camus does, to what's going on with Sisyphus. The work person of every day of today works every day in his life at the same tasks, and this fate is no less absurd. What's the worst job you've ever had?
Safeway.
Cashier.
Safeway, cashier,
Cheesecake Factory.
cheesecake. Yeah, I can see that. No, sorry, you still there? Okay. When you think back to that job, and then you read the story of Sisyphus pushing this boulder up a rock, and then that lucid consciousness, that lucidity, that experience of, oh my God, the rock's falling back down. Oh, it's going to keep doing this. Every day, I got to go back and push the rock up. Is your experience analogous? Or is this too extreme?
Definitely too extreme.
Too extreme?
Literally, yeah. I pushed carts up a hill, and then eventually they all went.
Wait, what is your job?
Albertson, Safeway, whatever you want to call it, Vaughn's.
Yeah, I used to collect carts, and then people would take off with them. It's like, what's wrong with you? I got to go find that and bring it back, and you have to go uphill?
I mean, it was a slope. It wasn't like
Still.
45 degrees, but it was
Well,
It's uphill.
So yeah, that's quite similar. But worse, you have to deal with
People.
shoppers. I don't want to say people. Sartre will say, in fact, what is hell? Hell is other people, which is the opposite of what Camus seemed to be saying, right? One of the things that we find with contemporary issues of this feeling of absurdity in a clinical sense is a loss of connection, and there's the alienation. A feeling of a loss, maybe as simple as group membership, and actual communication and connection with another person. Sometimes that's all it takes, right? And a lot of times doctors will tell us, look, there are patients that come in, they feel suicidal, and they feel like there is nothing that will change their situation. The only thing they can do is end it. They come in, we observe them for 3 days, and it passes. And it's hard to explain that to somebody that it passes. But that seems to be what holds on to people, why they stay. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get through all this, but I want to come back to that question of communication with other people and also that kind of connectivity. Yeah, go ahead.
Is the analogy of our lives to Sisyphus' days, like, is it like the start of our days when he's at the bottom and the end of the days when he's at the top? Or is it like our whole lives is this going up this mountain, and then the fact that our lives end is like...
I see. I wouldn't read it in that way, a day-night thing. I would look at it in terms of Dostoevsky's stupid man pushing the rock. Then when he gets to the top and it starts to fall, I recognize the absurdity of it. As I'm pushing it, I may not. It's the moment I recognize it's falling, I recognize the absurdity in it, the futility in it, that there isn't an ultimate purpose to it. And it's the consciousness, the awareness that what in the world is going on, that's where it is.
So like, being at the top and watching it fall down is basically just, that's the part that's absurd, and then getting out of it is going back down to like, doing it.
Wait. So getting out of what? You don't ever escape it.
So,
Well, you can
not
end it all,
like,
but
not
that's...
like escaping the, I guess like the consciousness of the absurdity, or like the paralysis of
Okay.
of understanding of the
Oh, I see. Because you're not paralyzed. You engage in act as well. You're not just thinking about it. You're not just pondering it. You're not huddled up in the fetal position. In fact, you are scornful. You are fighting it. Right? In fact, this gets us to that point I wanted to make. I'm glad we got right to it. Life becomes tragic only when we become conscious of our state. And so while we're engaged in our activities, and I think Camus likes the idea of us finding something, finding an activity. And this is not to belittle the point, but I mean, my wife makes the bed every day, and she says, I can't, she's influenced by Marie Kondo on this point, but she'd always done this. There's something to that concept of doing something. Start your day, and the military does this too. You hear it from generals as well. What's the most important thing you can do? Make your bed every damn day. That seems so silly, so trivial. It's not. If you're a writer, if that's what you do, write something. Start the day writing something. Even if it's shit, you've got it down, you've done it. You can come back to it. You can come back and work on it. Doing something. Even if you come to recognize, well, the sun is eventually going to explode and eventually this is all going to be gone, that doesn't take away the moments of your experiences, which is what Camus is going to focus on. Real quick, and then I'm going to get going.
Do people in like societies, like, do they only value people that are predictable and behave the way that they want them to, so they can feel like they have like control over their lives because someone's not acting in a way that is unpredictable? So that's why we don't like suicidal people, because we don't like the idea
I don't
of
know.
someone just like taking something.
I'll get to that. But
Okay.
that was too big of a question. I can't possibly answer that in deal, but in full. But why we're against suicide, that's I want to address. So, the world in itself is not reasonable. He uses the word reasonable there, but not rational. There's a difference between rational and reasonable. I'll come back to that, back to your earlier question, Eduardo. That is all that can be said, and he starts with that. That's just a fact. You don't see it, then you're not conscious. That's ultimately what he thinks. He doesn't argue for it, he just states it, and here are the experiences that are the consequences of it. What is absurd is the confrontation of the irrational and the wild longing for clarity, whose call echoes in the human heart. We cannot stop that questioning. It is, I don't know, it's our nature. I don't want to use that word. It's part of us. We can't seem to stop it. And yet we know, we come to recognize we cannot come up with an answer for it. We recognize the seeming absurdity of the ephemeral nature of existence. And I like the idea of connecting this with Buddhism. In particular, those mandalas that take sometimes hours, sometimes weeks of getting colored sand and creating these incredibly detailed, intricate, amazing works of art that are done what? What happens next? They blow them, I don't know with what, a blower I guess, completely destroying them, showing the impermanence of everything. The impermanence of everything. There are significant connections between Buddhism and Camus here, and that he mentions Buddhism, but he doesn't focus on it so much in the readings that we had here. Here are the two questions he raises, and I wonder if this is a false choice. Is one to die voluntarily or to hope in spite of everything? Both of those he disagrees with. In fact, at one point he says one should die not of one's own will. How does he put it?
Involuntary?
Not involuntarily, something like that. And he did. He died in a car wreck. He wasn't driving. He died, and unreconciled, he says. Hope is no good because it takes away the actual lived experiences of this life. Nietzsche, and is taking from Nietzsche here, unquestionably. Hope for the next life, the presumption that this is just a stepping stone for the next life, makes this life less important. Hope is, in fact, a negative for Sisyphus.
Go back.
I'll have these slides for you as well. In fact, they should be up now.
They are.
So, I don't think these are the only two options we'll see. Camus is going to give us another, and that is basically a kind of scornful yet smirking rebellion. Not ignoring the fact that the world is not rational. Here again, we discussed the question of reasonable versus rational. It may be the case that science can help us. I like how he gets into this discussion about knowledge and how science can give us certain facts, but then he dismisses science when science gives us models of the world. And what does he give us? What do they give us? Poetry. It turns into poetry. The idea of subatomic particles that we can't even experience. How do we even know these things exist? Maybe he just has an ignorance of science, or maybe he's got a point that science ultimately amounts to metaphor, to poetry, and we're not actually closer to the thing in itself. We're not actually closer to the world. It doesn't actually offer us evidence. The world is rational, even if not reasonable. I'm going to skip that. There's Louis C.K. I'm going to skip that as two. Although note this reading from Camus. If you get a chance to watch that YouTube video, it sounds like he's just channeling Camus. When Camus says, we too secrete the inhuman at certain moments of lucidity. Again, this lucidity, this consciousness is key. The mechanical aspect of their gestures, their meaninglessness, pantomime, makes silly everything that surrounds them. A man is talking on the telephone behind a glass partition. You cannot hear him, but you see his incomprehensible dumb show. You wonder why he is alive. This discomfort in the face of man's own inhumanity, this incalculable tumble before the image of what we are, this nausea, as a writer of today calls it, is also the absurd. This is where he and Sartre were pulling apart from each other. If they were still friends, he probably would have said, my friend Sartre says this. That's the term from Sartre. Camus was influenced by Henri Bergson, who's famous for a number of things, but one arguing about humor. Humor is the recognition of the mechanical in the inelasticity of the human upon the mechanical. Oh my goodness, I've forgotten the phrase. The mechanical encrusted upon the human. It's when people act like machines that we laugh. When people fall down and behave like things, we laugh at them. And it's a recognition of something that's funny, that's something that's off or absurd. It's not inconsequential, it's not irrelevant, that we find humor in the absurd and absurdity. And there's a kind of recognition of our contradictory nature. Back to Pascal. We are physical bodies that are inert, that are that emit sounds and noises and all these other problems, and we act in mechanical ways like things in the world, but then we also have our conceptions, our consciousness, and our awareness of our own contradictory state. And I'll return to this conception of humor later because I think it's a legitimate question as to why Camus' conception of scorn is the best approach to against the absurd. Let me see. I don't have my syllabus with me. Let's wrap this up here, and then I'll review it in the beginning of next class. What are some of the reasons why one should not end one's life? And Camus is against it, but not for the traditional reasons. Not for the religious reasons. God forbids it. And we'll see there's punishments. There's punishments in hell for those who have committed suicide. We see in Dante's Inferno. We owe it to society to remain. That's an interesting argument. We'll look at that briefly. We owe it to our future selves. That may make sense to us when we think about the clinical response to your feelings right now seem impossible to overcome, but they will pass. You owe it to yourself within 3 days, which is the typical time period for whatever reason. You owe it to your future self to stay. And I mean, this is a serious issue, this conception of suicide. This is a philosophical issue that ties in intimately. In fact, just, was it last semester, we had a student who had, I believe, committed suicide. I think that was this last year. If you know of somebody, or if you yourself are feeling this, talk to someone. There's a suicide hotline, which, by the way, that number I should have with me. I don't have it now. It's a serious matter. Connect with other people. If you have the time, talk about Camus, but get right to his arguments against it, his claims against it, rather than the philosophical querying about it. Talking about discussions about suicide are different than talking of suicide, or that one is going to engage in it. Those, of course, are different. And then we'll look at Camus, live for the accumulation of more conscious experiences, despite the world offering no ultimate meaning, and perhaps a lot of suffering. It's not a great ending place for class today. We're going to have to stop, though. We're out of time. Yes?
What fish was the Lucy gave?
A guy who gets a tan car with a trash bag for a window, and CK's like, why is that guy not ended his life? Nobody chooses tan. They give you tan. Nobody has a tan car on purpose. That was. All right, so I'm behind. I need to figure out how to catch up next time. So please bring the reading from Nietzsche next time to class. All right. Electronics, okay. Yep, electronics, okay.
I apologize for being so incredibly
That's
late.
all right.
I was taking a calculus exam and it went way over.
They let the exams go over?
Well, no, so I had previously not been in class for the exam and I had arranged to take
Oh, I'm
it
sorry. I got you.
at her office hours.
No worries. So
And
get
I
notes
had-
from class. The slides are posted.
Okay.
Yes. And let me know if you have any questions.
Okay, did we do the reflection today?
Yes.
Is there any way that I can make that up or no?
Not the discussion part. Did you turn in the reflection?
Yeah.
So you get those full points. So that's something. I dropped the lowest reflection. I didn't do that initially. That was a change from last time. So the lowest reflection's dropped.
Okay.
Presumably that'll be that one. Well, no, it'll be one that maybe you didn't, if you didn't turn one at all, that would be dropped.
See you later.
Yeah, I would recommend getting
Did you find out?